Anyway, you aren't supposed to do that, so that's the reason. Have a bill of sale for the dog. My father bought the puppy for me. Did he buy it?
Can we ask people to mute?
Sure.
Or you can actually just
You
mute
can mute
everybody.
all.
Just mute all.
You can ask him right there.
Well, you can mute, Jackie, you can just mute everybody.
What if they have a question or something?
Well,
Then
they
they
can
can
raise
talk.
their hand.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but nobody's sitting here monitoring.
No
it.
monitoring them.
Well,
They have a question, they can
Yeah.
mute.
Ray, could you just tell them please not to speak because everybody can hear what they're saying? Unless they're asking a question.
Yeah, just mute until
For
they.
those who are on Zoom, please do not speak or make any noise because we can't mute you if you want to ask us questions in the meeting. Please observe so we can have a conductive meeting. Thank you.
No.
We're not mute, so why don't we call this meeting to order? First item on the agenda is approval of the previous minutes. We all should have a copy of them. Comments or questions?
I have an extra sheet for you because our September 20th signature sheet didn't make it, so
It's in the box.
that's why.
It should be right up in the,
Is it? Yeah, because I didn't make it home with me.
that's okay.
But you think it's already up there?
I thought it was. Put it up in your box.
Okay, well, it's probably
But-
still there.
We'll check it at the end of the meeting.
Yeah.
Comments, motion?
I have a question. It's not that it's inaccurate, but it just has to do with, it said that the board seemed to be in agreement about the 3,000 tons. Okay, so are we not going to vote on that, or are we going to explore that more, or what does that mean?
Let's work our way through the minutes and we'll get to that point.
We don't vote in the beginning because we may make changes.
Okay, just asking.
So-
Didn't know what that meant.
Wait till we know we're sure. We may change it at some point.
At this point, we're just going with consensus until we get to the point. where we make firm
Have a vote
decisions.
then.
Any other questions? Hearing none, call for vote. All those in favor, please signify. You were there.
I have to signify.
You were
I am in
seated.
favor.
You were
Yes,
seated,
I was
yes.
on.
Thank you. Okay. Next item on the agenda is there were no bills at this time. And as far as the CEO report is concerned, I guess some of you might be aware of it, but Wally Moore accepted the job of being the CEO, and this morning he resigned. So we don't. Please.
Good to see you.
Please.
I sent him an invite. I don't know.
On Zoom, please mute.
Oh, shit.
He came to, the hospitals this morning, I believe. So he's still up there, right?
I had a member of New Jersey that survived pancreatic cancer for the. Oh, wow. CAT scan, a colonoscopy, and a PET scan, and it's nothing to worry about. So that.
I knew that about you already. That's because I'm not as full of something to say. Some people would be. So I have a question,
Bill?
So when if I sign you up on the sign up sheet, I would like to ask you if I can do that. Do I have permission to put you on a sign up sheet?
This is for the organizing meeting. Both of you are not members of Louisville community, so I think that probably you'll be guests of the.
Yeah.
Right.
They can hear now?
Hang on one second. I don't want Crystal to go through her whole thing and have no video. If you ask them if people on Zoom can hear, and I'll get something.
Can you hear us?
She can hear.
Yes,
Holly
okay,
can
we're
hear.
all set. Thank you, Deb.
You're welcome.
Which button would you hit?
The on. Microphone.
That's the one my wife shuts off.
Can they hear Crystal? Is that the
Yeah.
only microphone they
Yeah.
can hear?
Someone can't hear me. That would be the first of my
Okay.
lifetime.
Really? Yeah.
So, thank you so much. I'll backtrack just a little bit. Protect Maine's Fishing Heritage Foundation, 501(c)(3), been around for about 3 years, working on industrial scale aquaculture. So as part of the work with that, Protect Maine had put together an emergency moratorium. I know you all really are ground zero for American Aqua Farms and had your own emergency moratorium, which went through. Out of this process, we've had since, I think, May of this year, we had 7 communities come on board. And I know I'll forget one, so I'm gonna put my glasses on. Cutler, Winter Harbor, Machias, Port Beals, Addison, Rope Bluffs, and most recently Penobscot. So they have enacted an emergency moratorium. And one of the things that I heard very early on from the towns is, this is great, we'll do this because we see the need in our community. But what happens next? Because we don't always have the bandwidth at a planning board or select board level, particularly in some of the smaller towns, to deal with the ordinance. So we took the liberty of putting together an ordinance, and these communities are now considering it. There are some that have said no, no question about it, but we have 7 who said yes, and we have probably another 10 who are interested in a presentation. If I could just clone myself, I could get those done next month. But I think that will take 2 or 3 months. So if you take a look at this ordinance, particularly under section B, which is the purpose, it gives you a list of reasons actually why we decided to do this. And I'll highlight just a couple. You know, prevent a shortage of overburdening of public facilities. We want to protect the lobstering industry and other heritage fisheries, water-based recreation. And of course, you know, public trust is a really big piece of all of this. we define, if you go to the next page, third page, community scale and industrial scale. So community scale aquaculture is 5 acres or less, and we consider industrial aquaculture 5 acres or more for all species. That does not mean you can't have it. Go ahead, Ray.
Can these decisions of five industrial and otherwise, is that discretionary or is that legal in law or is that a decision made by your ordinance?
This is a suggestion.
Oh,
You
okay.
to adopt or not
Okay.
adopt. I really am.
On these limits I'm referring to.
Yeah. David, what would you answer that?
So that's something for the municipality to decide where they want to set that.
Okay, so that's
Example.
nothing,
There's nothing.
in concrete.
Set in, yeah, it's not
Nothing
set
in
in
concrete.
stone.
I'm
We
sorry.
really believe in, no, that's a good question. We really believe in home rule. And I know in some communities, particularly Cutler, they don't want any aquaculture of any kind ever again. That's not where other communities are going to fall. Probably it's not where your community is going to fall if you decide to move forward with an ordinance. So it does talk about all species in this. And I have something, the question comes up, why not just do a finfish moratorium? Why not just do that? We are seeing in the past 5 years, we're seeing 95% of all leases get approved from the Department of Marine Resources, regardless of species. There is acreage upon acreage that is being applied for. For example, there were 3 leases over 100 acres. 2 of them have been pulled down in the Portland Casco Bay area for seaweed. There's another one up in Stonington that just is going to a scoping session for 41 acres of sea scallops. The person doesn't live in town, person lives out of town. Okay, that's something to think about. Do you want it for your local community? Do you want other people looking at your community and saying, hey, they don't have an ordinance in place, this may be the place to go? Because when I look at people like Jerry Potter, who I know is behind me, and I sat at his kitchen table and we talked about acreage, I really heard how much bottom is being lost. What you'll hear from DMR is it isn't that much, there's so much ocean. Well, not all ocean is created equally. What's good for some aquaculture somewhere is good for lobstering, and not every piece of ocean is up for grabs, so to speak, from an environmental perspective. So I have a document from John Lewis that states some other concerns, and I got it late this afternoon. So I didn't have a chance to print it off for you, but I am going to highlight a couple of things, and then I'll send it to Ray, and he can share it with all of you. This is a concern about some of the genetics around seaweed aquaculture, not organic, not like what Sarah Redmond does, but people who are splicing aquaculture together. So John writes, much of the seaweed is actually sourced from the Sheepspot River in Midcoast, Maine. By moving this material throughout the state, we are effectively homogenizing the gene pools of seaweeds. Faculty at UMaine Farmington have identified 5 distinct populations of sugar kelp in the state. We are risking those genetic distinctions via movements and introduction of non-local genetics. And he talks about a company that's hiring a CRISPR technologist, which is a transformation scientist whose duties would be to include using gene editing technologies to create genetic strains that are desirable for farm product. The same concerns apply, like whether you're meshing it yourself or you're doing it through a technology, it's not native to the area. John Lewis is the former director of the Maine Aquaculture Association, and he left 2.5 years ago. He does a very small amount of consulting for Protect Maine, but he raised many of the same concerns that we have raised in talking with the commissioner of DMR. Large tracts, large number of leases getting approved, no real forethought about how we want our waters to operate. And then he says, regarding scallops and mussels, currently these species are farmed using wild-caught seed. There is no driven estimate of a sustainable removal rate of seed from the wild in these farming endeavors. Do farms remove only a small portion of seed that would likely die anyway? Do adult scallops and mussels significantly contribute to reproductive output as a whole? Currently, all arguments are strictly based on conjecture. So we have a lot of work to do. And so when I look at this ordinance for communities, I think, okay, so the state is not going to do it. what can the local communities do to protect themselves from something that is clearly exploded and that is on a runaway path? It's like a runaway train at this point. So to explain why this would work, David.
So hi, everyone. I'm David Callan. I'm a lawyer with Roman Woodson. I'd like to give you a little bit of background, but I don't come with a mute button. So if at any point you decide that
I'm the mute
more
button.
useful, exactly, by interrupting me to ask a question, please. Because the reason I'm here is to try and be useful to you in your decisions around this. So I'll give you a little bit of my background. Before I became a lawyer, I was actually a research oceanographer for the University of Maine. I worked at the Darling Marine Center on the Pemaquid Peninsula and studied phytoplankton, actually worked with some master students there that were doing work on phytoplankton for these small scale community-sized aquaculture operations in the Damariscotta River. I've been a lawyer now for a decade and a half. From the time I was in law school, I've done lots of work around marine issues, including in law school. And since then, I do a fair bit of municipal law. I personally and our firm represent a fair number of municipalities around the state. I've been doing a lot of work in the aquaculture space for over a decade. And that's included work up in this area at the time, back in 2014 when John Lewis, who was an individual that Crystal mentioned earlier, was still at the Department of Marine Resources and was their chief aquaculture operator. So we've been thinking about these issues and working on these issues for a long time. I've been working with Protect Maine since its formation. They've been working at the state level to try and address certain issues in state legislation, and then also have focused on municipalities and control that municipalities have where the state is deciding for whatever reason not to step in and exercise it. And so what we've done here is we've created a model ordinance that kind of tees up a lot of the avenues that are open to municipalities, and we've tried to be thoughtful about where we draw from for that. And so, for instance, you asked the question about the 5-acre issue. When we started 3 years ago, we did an analysis of the size of the acreage that was being operated at the time, and 5 acres seemed to be around an inflection point where somewhere just shy of 2/3 of the leases at that time were under that. And so the larger leases were the minority at that point. And what we're seeing now is, as the industry matures, we're getting more and more of large lease applications. And so that's starting to skew. But that's where that number came from. It was data-based where we landed on it, but it is purely that's a point that municipalities can decide based on the issues in their municipality where to put that sliding scale. The other thing that we did is we looked at ways that other development is regulated around the state and tried not to reinvent the wheel. One of those ways is that the state has environmental and site law permitting that happens for large scale industry throughout the state, and those apply even in coastal waters. Those two statutes that we used as the model are the Site Location Development Act and the Natural Resources Protection. They are called site law or SLOTA for the Site Location Development Act, and NERPA is the common term for the Natural Resources Protection Act. And anytime that you're doing development over a certain size, you need a site law permit. And anytime you're doing development that is affects coastal wetlands, any wetlands, but coastal wetlands, which include all submerged lands, you need a NERPA permit. And that includes those times when you might need a lease from the state. When you get that lease from the Bureau of Parks and Lands, who grants submerged land leases for all activities other than aquaculture. Those regimes have the standards that we drew from, we pulled straight from those state laws. And we felt like that was a useful thing to do for a couple of reasons. One, it's something that the state has found works for a lot of industries in general. Two, there you have a whole body of state agency thinking and rulemaking and permitting where they've looked at these standards and they've applied them in other situations. So when a town is looking at something and trying to figure out how to apply it, you've got other places to look, right? You've got the DEP has struggled with some of these issues or applied it in certain ways. And so we felt like we didn't, we could borrow the general statutory framework and municipalities could come up with their own interpretations, but if they were looking on how to apply that and they were looking for guidance on how others had applied something similar, they'd have that and looking at the DEP. And right now, the only reason that that the aquaculture leases aren't subject to that same regime is those two laws, site law and NERPA, have an exception. And they basically say, if you are getting an aquaculture lease under the aquaculture leasing statutes in Title 12, Section 6072 and the ones around it, then you're exempt. And the reason that all the other submerged land activities that you have to get a lease from the state when you get it from the Bureau of Parks and Lands aren't, is because they don't have those exemptions. But those site law and NERPA both say that that nothing in those acts is intended to limit the town's home rule authority to regulate in that space. And so that makes pretty clear that the legislature is saying, look, the town can decide on different exemptions or apply them differently. You can apply these rules to situations where we're not applying. That's what it means when the legislature says we're not trying to do, to preempt home rule authority. And so by focusing it on and basing it on those models and taking that approach, we felt like we were staying comfortably away from the thing that DMR expressed concern about when they sent out their kind of letter saying, hey, we're the only ones that can grant leases and you towns shouldn't be granting leases because the leasing authority for towns is limited to certain areas in the intertidal zone, et cetera. And that's true if what you're doing is that actual leasing decision, that decision about whether you want to become a landlord and rent to a private industry and actually limit the public trust uses, which is the way I think of as a lawyer and I think of as a submerged land. That's a state commons, it's publicly owned. And what a lease does is it actually limits public rights in that to say that you can have private rights. And so the legislature has said for submerged lands, only the state agency can limit that. That's DMR. But it said in circumstances, towns, if you have a shellfish ordinance and others, you can do that in the intertidal zone, which is usually privately owned, but you can limit those public trust rights, right? You can say to a clammer, you can't clam here because someone's doing clam aquaculture here. That's something a municipality can do in that leasing decision, that kind of landlord tenant decision under the aquaculture statutes. But that's completely different. And so that's the thing that DMR is right, that a town can't try and step in and do that in state waters. You can't do the thing that only DMR can do about granting a lease or not granting a lease. But on the regulation of industry, including the aquaculture industry, you can import that kind of site law and NERPA framework where the legislature has said they're not trying to occupy the field. They're not trying to be the only ones that are there. And so that's where we kind of based this framework, and that's where all this, the meat of this stuff comes from. And we felt like that also helped push back against some of the kind of what we thought of as unfounded talking points of the industry that was trying to just avoid regulation. It's not any sort of unfairness. These are the types of regulatory frameworks that apply generally to all industries in the state. And we felt like at this point, the aquaculture industry has matured enough and is showing that by actually like coming in at the scale they're coming in at to say that they should be regulated in the same way. In some ways, it was kind of a historical accident that all these exemptions worked because at the time that they were put into place, it was just a handful of small players. When I was dealing with this with John Lewis over a decade ago, John would go and literally dive under every site that applied for a lease of any size. And he was one guy. And so there were few enough leases that one guy could do that. That's not the case anymore. And
Can I
Well, and
Sorry.
so, yeah, so I'll stop and, and I want to actually make sure if people have questions, they should just ask the chair to be recognized and you can decide who can ask. them.
Yes, Crystal.
Yeah, okay. So a couple of things about that diving under the site. That was one of the things that the Maine Aquaculture Association got rid of. So no one is diving under net pens anymore. That is no longer a requirement under DEP, and I just wanted you to be aware of that. Jerry?
So, you answered my question.
Oh, sorry.
He said died before the application was given. And I wanted to ask if they dove under the pens after they've been used several years, see what was going on.
That's the place where they don't dive anymore. They do still dive around lease sites because they're looking for eelgrass, they're looking for all kinds of things. But especially the net pen salmon, in many cases, many instances, there's food that goes through the bottom, and that's where your problem comes in. And there are no eyes on that anymore. That ended in 2006, I believe. No,
I have-
it's before that.
I have you finished, basically? I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have another attorney,
Mhm.
another agency giving us a ordinance that we've been working on. Why yours and not ours? What is wrong with ours that we need to use yours? If I might be blunt.
Sure. And there's, I've talked with Tim Pease and the other attorneys and I who were working on this in our office. We were bouncing ideas back and forth. And we're not trying to say that there's only one way to regulate or to skin this particular cat. We've come up with something that we think we've worked pretty hard on to make legally defensible. And, we've also tried to structure it in a way that makes it easy for towns to add those other things that they think are important into it. So we think our framework can serve as that basis. There's a provision at the end that even makes clear that if there are individual sections that might be subject to challenge or otherwise, that we've, that those don't kind of infect the provisions that aren't subject to challenge. I'll note that part of the instigation for DMR to send out that what I think of as a rather unprecedented letter was some of the language apparently in that ordinance, or that was at least one of the early ordinances that were out there. And if I'm speculating, some of that might have been, certain language that gets used in DMR statutes. When they talk about, I talked about the lease decision, they also grant a whole bunch of different licenses for aquaculturists, including like how they sell their, how they ensure that the shellfish is safe to be sold and those other types of licenses. And some of the language that talked about a license early on in the drafting process may have caught their attention as something closer to that thing that they were doing. Now, as a municipal attorney, I'd say what you call things shouldn't matter as much as like what they are actually doing on the ground. I also kind of welcome the diversity of thought and the multiple approaches. So, we're not here to say like, don't go with those suggestions if you think that's what's going to be best for your town. But we are saying that we think that what we've crafted here is as legally defensible as we can make it, and as far away from what we think DMR's concerns were when they pushed out that letter as we can make it. And so that's where we came from. And
I just add just a tiny bit to that. I talked with Tim Pease, I don't know, it's like 2 months ago. And I said, some people in town had asked us to do this. What do you think? Because nobody wants to step on anyone's toes. That's the last thing we want to do.
You haven't danced with me.
Are you going to step on my toes? It's okay. I have a husband who does this too. But, he said, yeah, I think they should hear from multiple approaches. And I kind of let it just go away because I felt like things were moving along. And then I got some more calls and I'm like, well, maybe we should present it and see if they're interested at all. And that's why we're here. We respect the work that you have done. We are able to defend this in a court should it come to that. And we will for the communities who sign on to it.
Yes, Jerry.
Yeah, Ray, a question for the attorney. Has this document been peer reviewed by Tim or other folks in your organization? Or folks in your organization?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. In drafting, it's not like a scientific paper that has a peer review process for publication. It's formal. Certainly, this has been bounced off of a bunch of different attorneys. We talked to Kim while we were drafting it. We may have sent him a version of the final ordinance, final model ordinance. I honestly don't remember, but we talked about various approaches and the things that we were thinking about, and we've talked, talked internally to people at my law firm, and I've talked externally to attorneys at other places.
Yes, Mike.
I have a couple trains of thought, and one of them is, thank you very much for coming here and presenting. I'm a little taken back by Ray, your comment saying, what is wrong with our ordinance? We don't have an ordinance, we're working on an ordinance. And I feel like we've been through a lot of different versions of this. We were going finfish, then we went all aquaculture, got pushed back from that, went back to finfish. And Tim has consistently said he feels he could defend us having rights out in beyond the intertidal zone. But we have chosen in our group to say, well, let's not push that that area. And these guys are including that beyond the intertidal zone. So to me, I don't feel like we have an ordinance. We're working on one. And I feel like listening to other options, because we've been trying to think about measures of how much catch coming in. Here they're talking about acreage. Do we need to change how we are measuring what is okay in our community? And I would not be as defensive about saying what's wrong with our ordinance as I would also welcome Tim looking at this ordinance and getting his feedback and saying, I don't know, I just feel like we're in the process of creating an ordinance. We don't have an ordinance. We're creating it and we're tweaking it. And some of these ideas might be good. And another way to approach things, I had one question about community scale versus industrial scale. I think about like lobstering, people can get a personal license that's not a commercial license, and clammers can get they don't need a license, they go and get a certain amount for their own personal use. But it's using the word community scale versus industrial scale. Now, community scale, what if, I'm just going to use Sarah. I have no idea what her acreage is. Let's say her acreage is 5, but she is a commercial user, but she's not an industrial user. So for me, community, the word community, I'm looking for a different word there. I'm looking for a different word that is.
So this would not impact current leases in any way. So Sarah would not be impacted. That doesn't,
She already has them.
because she already has it.
And there's no such thing as relicensing a lease or anything, or
There's renewal
Renewal.
after 20 years.
20.
But they have never in the history, according to John Lewis, who was there for 23 years, denied a lease. And I would say that renewal. And I would say that has to be true, because after 116,000 fish died at Black Island last summer, they renewed it for another 20 years anyway.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
I don't worry about the renewal part. I think they'll get it. But to your point, I don't know, community scale, I don't know.
Yeah.
There's an awful word there.
And I'm also wondering if our board is open to revisiting beyond finfish. You're just saying, we've been down that road, we're tired of that road, but is there a way to bring it in with different measurements that, are we against looking at it? Because it is here. It's not just finfish. And originally we went down that road and got, some people said, no, that's not what the community voted for. But maybe it's time to do it all at once. And if there's a way to do it measuring area versus catch.
I will say the leases are getting bigger.
I have a question. When you were considering this, talking about community scale, what about clean aquaculture? In other words, so we did mention Sarah, who has more than 5 acres. But her aquaculture cleans the water. And so was that in your, kind of in your thought that maybe there is some aquaculture that's actually beneficial to the waters? What do you think, Jerry? Like it doesn't hurt the ocean to have clean aquaculture, but
Yeah.
it does to have dirty.
And I think that gets at, if you look at what the actual licensing criteria are, right? Those aquaculture processes and species that are able to demonstrate they have a net benefit effect, they can much more easily satisfy no unreasonable impact standard on, the surrounding flora and fauna, or, the other things that are in here. So yes, the idea is just like, kind of as I was saying, we modeled this on the state model, that rather than try and pick things as a category and say, like, this technology is good and this technology is bad, we are going to say, look, we're going to think about impacts on the scale. And again, we picked the acreage issue because that's in part how the state works on the Site Location Development Act. And we set the standards that they have to meet as standards that anyone has to meet. And when they are clean and able to show that they're clean, it is much easier for them to meet those standards.
Okay, but I would also say it's too easy to say clean aquaculture and dirty aquaculture.
Well, that's just,
Yeah, but you're, in water net pen salmon, tougher sell, right?
Right.
But we're watching some leases that have incredible density and scale.
The mussels.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the literature on this is, I work with a scientist out of Dalhousie up at the university, Dalhousie in Canada. And she sent me a couple of papers because we're starting to see some of the issues when you pack, it doesn't matter what it is, right? When you pack in all these animals in a very small location, you start to get some kind of issue, even though primarily oysters clean, right? But when you start to pack too many animals into an area, then you run into problems.
Feedlot.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. One question. Have you worked with Tim on this?
So, no, I mean, we're happy to, if Tim, like, again, the person that gets to decide who can pick up the phone and call Tim on behalf of Gouldsboro, that's Gouldsboro.
Right.
And so we kind of reach out to Tim as a colleague, and we don't, their Maine has a pretty collegial bar, but we're careful about how much we press that when we don't get to decide who pays his bill. So we're using his time for free, essentially.
Right.
But we will certainly, if you guys want to send this to Tim and say, what do you think? And call them up and ask them any questions for things that you like, that you're like, why don't we adopt this? We will go.
Well, I don't think we're going to make a decision on whether or not to go your way tonight or at all. And I think what we probably will do is study it. And I would recommend that we send it to Tim, have him share it
I
with
think
us.
that'd be great.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. Maybe more.
Can I ask one question? Your size on this is based on scale for community versus industrial. I mean, what's to say that they can't set up pens in Stu Bend? It's in Stu Bend waters, and then operate this facility here. Just don't net Stu Bend here.
Yeah, and again, there are different approaches that towns could take, right? The town's regulatory authority is going to be limited to the town's waters. And so what you see sometimes, I don't know if you guys have ever had to deal with a subdivision that crosses municipal boundaries. That's a situation sometimes where the two planning boards get together. So if they've got, in those cases, usually both towns have a similar framework. What the state does for some activity is they define common scheme of development. What we try to do is look at, if you're going to put a 5-acre lease over on one side in town, if that's a nautical mile away from a 5-acre lease somewhere else in town, we're going to treat those separate. And what we did is we said, if you've got a handful of like small areas that are all within 1,000 feet of each other, we're going to treat that all as one thing. And part of the reason we got there is one of the things that we realized working with DMR over time is as the leases get bigger, what they do is they start just putting these navigational channels through them. And we didn't want a situation where, someone had essentially in a 20-acre area, they had 16 acres of aquaculture that was 4 4-acre squares. And to us, that seemed like that was one thing. Now, again, those types of boundaries, like how close is it, like is 1,000 feet the right distance, or is anywhere in town, or how do you count activities they might have outside of your town? Those are areas where municipalities would have some discretion. And what we tried to do is not get too hung up on making things really complicated by the edge cases and say, all right, what works for most of the waters in town? And, if what happens is that like a few towns end up with protective ordinances that work well, and people try to skirt that by like locating just outside their boundaries, that's the classic time when the state really should be stepping. And we think that if towns step up and really step, demonstrating that these are having impacts that they feel like they have to address, then that can also change the balance of, who's got whose legislator's ear in the legislature. Because frankly, up until recently, up until you had things coming at the scale of an American aqua farm, what's tended to happen, it like happens in many industries, is that the industry ends up with a trade group. The trade group is funded by dues from the industry. They have lobbyists that are up there all the time. The people that end up getting affected, and what we saw early on with aquaculture, it'd be a few people in this community, and they get really worked up about the one thing that's coming to their community, and they fight the battle, and it consumes them, and then they win or lose, and they're wiped out. And they don't want to go try and like organize people to like talk to their state legislators. And frankly, that was part of what led to the formation of Protect North's Fishing Heritage, was to try and have voices that would be would be able to kind of collect that energy and activity from different areas in the state and make sure that the state legislature was hearing. And we think that towns acting to regulate under the authority they have is another important voice that just kind of steps up and says, look, the industry's changed, and the way it's regulated should too.
Hi,
Can you hear us in the Zoom?
Yes.
This is Robert Nichols. I don't want to interrupt, but please let me know a good time to weigh in.
Interrupt now.
Okay, thanks, Ray. So I've talked to Crystal about this ordinance. I'm very happy, and I've told Tim about it. I'm happy to take a look and see the methods by which you would measure, whether it's acreage or density or whatever. I think nobody's got everybody's got good ideas that are worth looking at, and I certainly agree that DMR's statement about exclusivity of jurisdiction in the water and preemption is just wrong. Whether Gouldsboro wants to risk litigation is a different issue, but I certainly think that Gouldsboro could exercise concurrent jurisdiction if it wishes. So I certainly like the idea of looking at different ways of measuring what's allowable or not. And I think this is worth throwing into the hopper with Tim. And to your point, Ray, nothing will be decided tonight, but this could be a good point of reference.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, to pick up on that, Department of Marine Resources believes it has jurisdiction. And this would be precedent setting, this ordinance here, because you'd be using other main laws to challenge that. And where was that going to take us legally? It sounds like a unprecedented legal situation.
Go
Well,
ahead.
it's unprecedented with regard to this particular type of ordinance. But just 2 years ago, DMR tried to assert exclusive jurisdiction in another case and lost in the Maine Supreme Court. So them saying they have exclusive jurisdiction doesn't exactly carry water, so to speak.
Well, and the other thing that I'd say, so I'd say a couple things. We really worked hard on this to be something that was what we could get the most people to feel like this was legally defensible, and Protect Maine's fishing heritage wants to stand behind that and would defend its ordinance language if adopted by any town. And the other thing that I'll say is, our system does allow almost anyone to challenge whether something can be applied to them. But what we're doing here, this isn't, I wouldn't say that it's unprecedented. What we're doing is, this is a legal regime that applies, if you want to put a pier in submerged lands, you need a NERPA and SLOTA permit as well as submerged land lease. If you have a water treatment facility and you have a pipeline that goes out into the submerged lands, you need a lease from the Bureau of Parks and Lands, and you need state environmental permits.
But not DMR.
Not DMR in those situations, you get it from DEP. And so that's the thing it's really what's kind of unprecedented is that DMR thinks that even though there's another state agency, which is the Bureau of Parks and Lands, that grants submerged land leases and other activities, and that it's clear that that same authority that they have, that they're not exclusive, because DEP also regulates, and frankly, the towns also regulate. Most municipal shoreline zoning ordinances require permits for piers and other things that are connected to shore, even when they're below the low tide line. It's kind of unprecedented for a state agency to say, well, our authority that's the same as a sister agency is exclusive for us when it's not exclusive for them. And the other thing that I'd say is that authority to regulate things like piers under shoreland zoning, that comes from a provision of the Shoreland Zoning Act that we also cite in the authority provision here that gives express authority for structures that are below the low tide line. So that's not in the intertidal zone. And so that's another thing that we really focused on here. That hook under the shoreline zoning statute is to go after structures. And most of these large scale operations are much more structure heavy than the older and smaller scale. And so there is precedent in each case for each of the things we're doing. We don't yet have, so in that sense, it's precedented. In the more narrow sense of, has a community yet adopted an ordinance that regulates structures being used for marine aquaculture? That hasn't happened yet. So
That's what I'm getting at.
and that's just the way that our law develops generally.
Remember, Gouldsboro was unique because we have a fish factory. We've had it for over 75 years, and it wants to be reused. So our address of this ordinance so far has been approaching how to control that factory and the impact that factory will have on the town. Not the water, because we felt the position was to stay out of it. So far, that's why we stayed with the finfish situation. Yes, Jerry.
Just to make it clear, all the words that are in the document here pertain to an area that is from the high tide mark 3 miles seaward. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Which is everything, as I understand the last 4 or 5 planning board meetings, you have constantly been saying, we're talking about an ordinance that is a land-based ordinance, not on the water. So what you have already from Tim, and you've been considering, my understanding is it's an ordinance that comes down to the high tide mark. And we hadn't yet had the big argument about the intertidal zone that we knew was probably going to come along. But right now, that's the way it's kind of set up. What you've got on the table, right now is, from Tim, is kind of land-based, finfish.
Yeah.
And what this gentleman has been, and Crystal has been providing, is a model ordinance to go from that high tide mark 3 miles seaward.
And we did that somewhat intentionally to try and have a standalone water-based ordinance only because most municipalities regulate on land already. You've got your Shoreland Zoning Act, many municipalities have various site law provisions and other zoning provisions. And so and municipalities have a huge amount of authority on land, but it also usually means that you're amending existing ordinances or fitting them into the other ways you're regulating on land. And so what we tried to do was do a water-based ordinance only that could be completely complementary and not step on the toes of what any town was doing on land. So that you had kind of free reign to keep doing whatever you were doing in whatever way it fit aquaculture on land into that scheme, however you thought it was appropriate. So that was also part of why we really tried to focus on something that really was just water-based.
So what are your thoughts on potentially combining some of our land-based ordinance with this?
We would welcome anything with no pride of authorship. If Tim wants to take sections completely from this and integrate it, we would be very supportive of that.
We'd extract sections if we wanted to do that. Yes, Darren, over here.
Excuse me, Lloyd Gruber. Crystal, did I make this up or did I hear you say that, or maybe David said, I'm not sure.
All right, I hope it wasn't me. Go ahead.
If Goldsboro were to adopt this ordinance, which
Yeah.
would apply
Yeah.
to part of potentially applicable, that protecting fishing heritage would defend us.
So we've both said versions of that, but how would you characterize it being the legal line?
Yeah, so yes, we would, if there was a suit that was challenging the application of an ordinance using our language that a town adopted, we would come into that suit to defend the language. A town town's able to choose what lawyer they want to represent them and what positions they want to take. So we're not suggesting that we'll come in on behalf of the town, but we will be there standing side by side with the town defending our language. And that's the way I would put it.
Good.
Yeah, I have a question. Yeah, the town has a litigation insurance policy for this kind of thing. So this is a question for you: is if we adopted, say, Tim and you guys get together, which I would love to see, and to be partisan, put this to get have a strong ordinance on land and water, and then the DMR sued, would that litigation policy also be applicable since they're attacking versus us? We can't use it to go do things, but if it came at you, what's your experience with that?
Yeah, so I'm going to just say that I can't give you advice on your insurance policy, especially when I haven't seen it.
Right.
But and so that may be a question for Tim. But your insurance will cover your lawyer to defend you in the way that you choose to exercise that. And separate from that, Protect Maine's Fishing Heritage
will do their thing.
Will do their thing.
Yes, Jackie.
Yeah, I have a question. So the 5 acres in the ordinance, and you said you want towns to be able to have some home rule. What are the parameters on that? 10 acres, 15, 20? And at what point, David, you would still be willing to represent the town?
Right. So I don't know. That would be, the way I would think about so that's going to be a decision. Protect Maine is a 501c3. It has a board of directors that's going to make decisions on their behalf. And because they haven't made that decision, I can't really speculate. But the issue is where you set that, what's going to happen is some aquaculture use in the water is going to be subject to the ordinance language that, because that's the way a challenge is going to come up, right? And in that context, it seems like the same interests that Protect Maine has in seeing their language upheld and defended in court would likely apply there. So those are factors that, the board, the 501c3 board at the time is going to take into account. But as a practical matter, if their language is there and it's being tested against a 100-acre lease site, is probably not going to be that many boards that are going to be like, well, no, because they would allow a 20-acre site to not be right. Right. So, I think that's my kind of lawyerly way of saying I can't really answer your question.
Circuitously.
But if the language is being tested, I suspect that the organization is going to want to be.
Yes, right.
Yeah, what are some of the reasons that other communities have rejected it? What were some of their feedback?
Well, I'll start with Sorrento, because I know that's got to be a hot topic of conversation in town. I apologize. I went on a 4-day vacation, and we had someone who is very well versed, but hasn't been in it to the depth that I have. And frankly, when I talked to James West today, he said that he didn't realize the vote was coming up, and James is a big lobsterman over in Sorrento. I think we heard from a very small aquaculturist who decided to put the fear of God into the people who were voting. And I'm not done with Sorrento yet.
Are they done with you?
Absolutely not. Particularly the lobstermen.
Yeah.
We all know how we feel about lobstermen.
That's all right.
That's all right. So I'm not done yet. More to come.
Do I have a question?
Yes, Jerry.
So the town can't regulate beyond high water mark, any regulation?
The town can.
The town can.
Yeah. But the authority is somewhat different, right? Like, in broad brush, from the low tide line up, you can assume that's basically private property, and you can regulate private property in the same way the legislature can. From the low tide down, that's essentially public property. And although you have the same home rule authority within your boundaries, and there's municipalities have harbor masters. Those harbor masters obviously operate in the harbor below the low tide line. There's clear authority in the harbor master statutes that the municipal officers or the town by ordinance can designate navigational channels that have to be kept clear. Like all those things, that's straight regulation. And as I said, in the Mandatory Shoreline Zoning Act, there's a provision that makes clear the town has jurisdiction to regulate structures below the low tide.
Yeah.
So all of that is very clear the town's got that kind of authority. The thing you don't have is the thing that the state keeps, and that's since they essentially, it's not quite this simple, but since they're kind of the landowner, they get to decide whether to become the landowner.
So when they put in for these permits, they pick where they want to go, that road. So they pick the spot they want, and like I said, they know what they did the homework, they know what they're doing. Because I fished from Bay all my life, and look at me. But anyways, they pick the hot spot for shrimp. Shrimp can go for 25 winters, and they're about to fish for 55 years. But anyways, they couldn't pick for deep, cold water. They couldn't pick any better spot on your chart for many miles. In other words, if you leave South Cusco and go and you hit 52 fathom at the heart, you probably only gone a mile. If you want to run from Korea or Prospect Harbor or Winter Harbor or Sorrento or Hancock, Des Moines, any of them places, straight offshore, you can find another 50 fathom hole, 50 fathom deep water, you're going to have to go 15 to 20 miles. There's 2 deep holes in Frenchman's Bay, old Frenchman's Bay. One of them is off the heart. On my sound, it was 52 fathom deep. On the side might be 50, I'm not sure, but 62 fathom. Off the the ball rock, it's 40 fathom deep. There's 2 depots. And shrimping, I used to leave when I had fish there in the winter because I go shrimping, I go up to the hop and set out for that, over the depot, 50 fathom depot. I might get there as quick as I could up head out of the boat. And I told the depot and numb the shrimp, do good. And you make another call and you get less because they scatter up onto the shoal bar. So, and it's the same with ball rock, same thing. You get there quick and then they scatter. So that tells me they're in there spawning. Every shrimp you catch is full of spawn. The boats from Portland, I even went and talked to a fellow that's 10 years older than I am, so I made sure I wasn't telling you something that wasn't true. I said, didn't they? Dale Torrey did. He told. And I says, didn't they come from Rockland with them big steel boats to help us drag up in Frenchman Bay? He said, they sure did. He said, yeah, they came from Portland too. I thought they did, but I didn't know for sure. That's why I went down to see him. So what I'm getting at, they need them 2 depots, cold, deep water, crystal clear water. They're sewage, because they're pumping over 400 billion gallons of water through their so-called closed pans. Closed pans. Well, the closed pans are nets. Now, how can you, when they say closed pan, it sounds like waterproof. And it would have to be something that's waterproof, and then you can't pump water to it. So it's not closed pans. They take that stuff that's caught in the first one, the funnel, and that goes down into the second one, the bigger stuff. They take that and they squish it, the juice out of it, and bring it into Prospect Harbor. And then they dump the juice from that poop and the pellets that's got chemicals in it for feed that make the fish grow from smoke to market size in 1 year. You think of that chemical? And this is in the feed. So they squeeze, and the water, the juice that comes out of these blocks that they squeeze goes in a tube back in the Frenchman Bay. So everything they're squeezing out goes back in the Frenchman Bay. And over time, 24 hours around the clock, never stop, anything can be done. So then if they don't have, I'm hoping Goldsboro can have some say about the waters, you know what I mean? That's what I'm getting at, along with the state. I was hoping the state would beef up, because that's when any of them big companies going to keep coming. They're not going to give up, and other ones will come, and they're going to come for that area. I tell you, and it's a hot spot for lobsters. That's one of the best fishing. If you don't believe me, I can take you out my lobster boat and cut them back from the hot boat around. That right now, so they'll move offshore here shortly, but they fish that hard. And the rumor went around when I was shrinking back in the 70s and 80s. The rumor went around that DMI, I can't say this is true, don't take me word for it, but the DMI was thinking about closing down Frenchman's Bay to shrimping because the shrimp stock was falling down. They were trying to save, reserve a place for them to spawn from the Hart to the mainland up to Hancock. The whole Frenchman's Bay. Were preserved from they were spawned. Now they're going to fill it full of the aquaculture, these giant aquaculture places in the area, and I believe that it will destroy in time. They will destroy the waters, and we need rules and regulations from the town and from the state to hold these back. That's what I'm getting at. I need to tell you that because I fished with them waters.
Thank you.
They want them deep, cold depots.
Realize that.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just wanted something that Jerry said. They're not going to stop coming. He couldn't be more right. There is active recruitment in this state, bringing people like Michael Rones, and there's an article today, Jackie, that was published in a newspaper that he may have done something else similar to what he allegedly did before, spent time in jail for. But we're just too attractive because our leasing process is $100 an acre. And you can hold those leases for 20 years and you can hold up to 1,000 acres. So taking control or whatever control you can take of the water just seems really prudent because we are so attractive to this kind of investment. And the money going out is in the millions. And I just wanted to say one more thing about what Becky brought up, about why it was defeated. And in part, there has been the thought that Protect Maine was not supportive of small aquaculturists, and we very much are. It's hard to demonstrate all the time, but I'll tell you this Friday, I'm working with a group out of Freeport who was going to protest this small aquaculture lease, and we're all coming together, and hopefully there'll be a big kumbaya. It's nothing I would like better than to put myself out of business. And by that, I mean, no need to hire lawyers, no need to hire consultants, because the rules and regulations are in place so that everybody can, we like to say, live, work, recreate, and make a living on the water together. And that's a really important part of this conversation for me. So if you hear that we're not supportive of small aquaculturists, you can call me up and say, how'd it go on Friday? Because I think we will have avoided a lot of lawyers and a lot of costs and a lot of heartache in a community if it all plays out the way I hope it will. And that is the kind of work that we do very much behind the scenes, as well as an ordinance, as well as an ordinance moratorium. And I just wanted you to know that.
Well, I thank you very much. We're obviously not going to make a decision tonight because we
Ray.
haven't. Yes.
It's Robert again. First of all, lawyers are not bad people, but putting that aside for a second, not all of them. I actually have a question for the lawyer. I've been working on this theory that I don't know if it'll work, but it seems to me before DMR is allowed to give a lease, the harbor master has to sign off on this from the town. Isn't that right?
It's in the water of the town.
The harbor master has to give a report, but they don't actually have decision-making authority on the leases themselves. They have a little bit more authority for the really small scale, what they call LPAs, that are essentially year-to-year licenses.
So 2 years ago, Robert, Protect Maine did a survey of all harbor masters statewide, just to say, hey, what's your training? Where do you come from? There's some people, harbor master jobs in some communities are kind of giveaways to police officers who are retiring, need to fill out a pension. And a lot of the harbor masters, in fact, there was a bill the last session because the harbor masters recognized that they need more training. That's not this to say every community, but a lot of them felt like they didn't have any training and the funding was not approved for more training.
So here's where here's where I was going. Yeah, here's where I was going with this. And I'm asking, under Maine law, I haven't studied this. If the harbor master says our town does not want this and is not, we're making clear that we don't want this, we're not doing the study, we're not signing off on anything. What effect would that have on DMR? Do you know?
Well, so DMR still would have authority to approve it. I will say that the aquaculture leasing statutes do allow municipalities to intervene in any leasing decision as a matter of right. And a municipality can state the position of the municipality and can request conditions on the lease. The only requirement on DMR in response is that if DMR decides not to adopt a requested condition, they have to explain in writing why they're not doing it. So that's not really an avenue to try and take control. I will say one of the things, though, that we heard previously about why they're coming to these deep shrimping holes and how the state should be stepping up and towns should be stepping up. We agree, and we've worked. I mean, Frenchman's Bay United was mentioned. It's a separate organization from Protect Maine's Fishing Heritage. They brought a lawsuit essentially arguing that what was described as the excrement that they're kind of squishing and then trucking onto shore, that was essentially solid waste and should be regulated as solid waste under the state's solid waste rules. Now, what DEP said in response is, at this time, we're not regulating that as solid waste. So we were hoping the state would step up and regulate in that context. Well, it's on the one hand, too bad that the DEP isn't deciding to treat that as solid waste because it really feels like it should be. On the other hand, there's a whole body of case law on that the state preempts the field on the regulation of solid waste. But if the state's saying we're not regulating this as solid waste, that's a whole avenue that then isn't preempted by the town. Because the state has already said that authority that we have that's exclusive to regulate solid waste, that we're not treating this as solid waste. So again, like we've really worked across the state level, across municipal levels to pull what levers we can to say, here's an industry that's having impacts in our waters that are a lot more extreme than what we kind of grown up being used to. And we've got these different regulatory regimes. Why aren't we treating them the way we treat other industries? And you know, when we pull on one lever, sometimes it works. And when it doesn't work, sometimes it opens that avenue for a different lever. And that's the same thing when the state's saying we're not going to treat that squished stuff as solid waste. That says to the town, you can regulate that squished stuff.
That's what we have ordinances. That's part of what we have, a solid waste ordinance, as well as what we're going to include, was included in here, was to, and they eliminate the amount of it that could be processed in the area.
And we apply those type of approaches too.
Yeah. Yes,
So
Jackie.
David, so what you're saying is the town can enforce this solid waste, but that's on the water. You're talking about on the water. They're doing it on the water.
Once it comes to land, we control it.
Yeah, but I think he's saying that you can also do it when it's out in the water, under this ordinance, right?
So this ordinance does not take that. This ordinance is based on what I described earlier, the NERPA and SLOTA type of standards. It's not based on a solid waste type of regime. The town's authority within, like, on land is very clear. I think that unlike some of the zoning and land use laws, your authority to regulate that type of solid waste stuff is coextensive with your municipal boundaries. So it should operate in the water as well.
Because they were talking about doing that off Scoodic Point. I think that was roughly where that was going to be happening.
What? Were they going to?
After they were emptying out the pens and they were carrying the weight, they were going to be squeezing it on the barge before they came back here. And all that was going to be going into the water. And it was right around Scoodic Point. And I think someone else had raised an objection to that. And I think it might have been the federal EPA about how can you be, because I think that's Class A water. Do I have that right, Crystal? Or?
I'm not in my depth right at the moment.
Okay.
I've got memory failure, but it sounds right,
Yeah.
but I can't cite it exactly.
Well, our current ordinance has a definition for solid waste, and it would include this. What we're proposing to work with here has addresses a solid waste once it comes on shore, and how long it can stay on shore, and how far it has to get out of town, how much time it has to stay in town. So that's all part of what we're trying to pull together, and it's still loose. Yes, Beck.
David, this might be a really silly question, but what about stuff that happens out beyond our inland zone that washes ashore? Like there's no boundary. There's just this virtual boundary that says this is DMR and this side. But a lot of things happen out there in that deep water that wash ashore. What's our defense to that? Like pollution and stuff that come ashore, but it wasn't created in our inland zone. We're affected.
Yeah, I think that's almost too general a question to really answer.
Yeah.
But we have overlapping regimes at, you know, the federal, state, and local level that all kind of can control different aspects of that.
One of the things that we're looking at is a mitigation bond or clause for any action caused by this corporation that affects all the good words about Google. They are responsible for it financially. And that's part of what we were playing around with here. And that would cover it. How we define the bond and how big it is and so forth, and renewal of a license, it all ties together as to if they do have a problem.
it seems sort of, like an oil spill or something. There's bonds to clean it up, but there's a devastating impact on the environment that should have something that prohibits it from that possibility. That's what that's when we get to the clean, dirty. I go, something that could be so potentially harmful, like that model. I don't know, the model that Henry had going on there for a while was looking like, whoa, look at it accumulating. It's like, I don't want their money to clean it up. I want regulation to prevent it from the first place.
Yeah, so there are, I mean, there is a Federal Clean Water Act. Maine has delegated authority to issue what are called Maine Pollution Elimination Discharge Permits, MIPD's permits. And there are standards that all dischargers have to meet. And so that gets at it in one way, right? But it is also one of the things, like you're saying, when we start modeling certain of these kind of deep water holes that have characteristics that have thrown wild stock forever, and you start to realize the way that the nutrients circulate, sometimes the assumptions that people had, I mean, like the old trope for, the pre-Clean Water Act, that whole dilution is the solution to pollution, and people would dump things in the rivers thinking that that meant that they would just be spread out to sea. And we know that didn't happen. We know that prior to the Clean Water Act, you could light many of our rivers on fire. And what we're learning is that some of the assumptions that we had that said, well, now we've gotten to the ocean and the ocean's huge. Maine has a really complicated coastline. And that's part of the reason why it's been so great for so many wild stock in the Gulf of Maine. But it's also part of the reason that this assumption that you made it to the bay, so you're in the ocean and stuff will eventually mix and filter out in this large water body, that doesn't hold true. And so, those types of things, that's incremental change within the existing permitting structure.
I can tell you an experience of that for a fact. I learned to water ski in the Hudson River in the 60s. You don't fall. Everything on the river was pumped right into the river and right on down. You learn to water ski real fast.
It would seem to me that the simpleton approach to this is you can't buy enough insurance. And by that, what I mean is, why not proceed down the way of seriously, to the extent that what we have on the piece of paper here tonight does not contradict or end up in an argument with what Tim's been bringing along, or whatever we're calling it, the finfish aquaculture licensure ordinance. Bring them together. The more words that you have to be explaining the position of the town, the better off you are.
Good example. You are.
Exactly.
Thank you. Okay.
Hi, can I say something?
Yes.
Hey, this is Nick Pastor, in South Goldsboro, oyster farmer. I just wanted to make a comment. I don't know what the end goal of Protect Maine Fishing Heritage is, but I want to speak to the board directly here and say that so far your decisions have been very supportive of independent aquaculture. We thank you, and while also working to protect against corporate companies like American Aquaforms, which we're all against. But I ask you to please be careful with working with Protect Maine. There are only 3 aquaculture companies in Goldsboro, and we're all independent contractors. We're all operators by ourselves. Myself, Sarah Redmond, and Joe Young in Korea. The majority of aquaculture operations in the state of Maine are 1 to 2 people operations. We're on the same page as fishermen. We're sole proprietors. Are there corporate companies in aquaculture? Yes, there's corporate companies and everything. This isn't the answer. This isn't going to help. The only thing I see here that this is going to do is put more restrictions on small scale operations and stop any growth of being able to be self-sustainable in these small scale operations. Crystal says that Graham in Sorrento was putting the fear of God in voters. But honestly, I think it's Crystal that is doing the fear mongering. She's trying to divide fishermen and aquaculturists. Okay, we're on the same page. I fished the last 4 years in South Goldsboro. Jerry Potter is a good friend of mine. Okay, we work together. I don't put gear where fishing. Sarah doesn't. Sarah has 20 acres on outside of Stave Island. She didn't put it there where there's fishing gear. We all work together. We're part of this community. We all don't want American aquafarms. We all don't want corporate aquaculture, but things like this proposed moratorium aren't the answer. They're not going to help us in the long run as a community. It's only going to divide us. And that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. If I might, whatever we end up with is going to have to, somebody's not going to be happy. So somebody will be happy.
May I speak to that?
But yes, in a moment.
Yes, thank you.
We will try to do the best we can for the town and for the people in the town and try to that's why we're taking this slowly. And one of the items on the agenda is to extend our moratorium. So we make sure we get it done right the first time and not get caught short. I just wanted to share that. Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so what I'd like to say is to everybody, I think the future for this area 20 years from now is going to be in clean aquaculture, stuff like Nick is doing, like Sarah is doing. I agree with you about limiting the amount of the scale of even that, like how many mussels you're going to cram into a little lease. But I think that if we can make, as Becky has brought up a lot of times, a distinction between something that pollutes and something that actually is of benefit to the waters. And I really support Nick and Sarah and Joe Young. And I think that we don't want to divide our community. We want to support what I think the future is for the Bay and for all of us. Thank you.
This board is supposed to represent the town, and I think we have 8 different points of view, and there's only 7 of us sitting here.
Yes.
And I think that's the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And we'll work it out. Yes, sir.
If I can just make a comment about whether the 5 acres is something that we agree upon or you agree upon or not. The mechanism that is in the Chickamain Fishing Heritage Ordinance is much more effective, I believe, in setting limits, in limiting scale that people cannot get around. I mean, one of the things that we've been looking at a lot is, including the draft ordinance that, we were looking at from the last meeting, is that limit of 3,000 metric tons, for example, is something that simply people could just hide or lie, or because there's no regulation in it yet to ensure that's good. I mean, that's an important point. This approach, you're limiting the size of the factory floor, and that's it. There's a certain amount of production that will come out of that, and not anymore. So, I mean, thinking about the ordinance, however it goes, you've got to be really cognizant about how people are going to get around, because they're motivated by millions and millions of dollars. And they're smarter. They're thinking of things right now that we haven't even. Yes.
Well, just one thing on the point of what we all think on the board and what people think here, who it's great everybody showed up, is I think the town did express itself very clearly with the 2 votes at town meeting, I mean, 200 to nothing, or to 3 rather, to do the moratorium, and then to designate the money for Tim Pease to do the ordinance was also unanimous. I mean, I don't think this community, most of them want big, corporate aquaculture here. So it's like, I think that's important to keep in that. We're representing them. We're representing the taxpayer. We're all taxpayers in this room, I would think, but that's who the point of view is kind of should have been is a little bit given to us that we're trying to protect the town from this overarching stuff that's going to destroy it at the level that these companies want to be at.
Go ahead.
One last thing from me.
Promise?
I swear, because I'm tired. I'm going to start driving. You've thrown me right off my game with that.
I know.
You know, again, we do support small aquaculture, but I go back to a conversation I had with someone in Hancock last summer who has a son who's a small aquaculturist. And I sat down with that person and I said, you know, we're really not against small aquaculture. And we were talking about policy, and this conversation went on for 2 hours. It was a long conversation. And the answer to that was, it's fine as long as it doesn't affect this person. Just exempt this person. And I just, you know, I'm sure you already know this, but policy is made from good policy. And the personalities that have become involved in this from the aquaculture industry sometimes are, you know, policy is good policy. And that's what I just want to say. At the end of the day, that's where we stand, and that's why.
Appreciate it. And the fact we have this, we got something to work with. And that's the important part, because we didn't make the decisions here. We didn't brainstorm it. It has to come from everybody. And that's why there's so much input from the community on this before it gets done. The final results will be blamed. Somebody's going to blame us for something.
Always.
Well, I just had to go out the door and talk to my wife and take care of it. And she's on Zoom too.
You're in trouble now.
Oh, got it. What's new? Thank you, folks. Appreciate it very much. Yes,
I would
Jackie.
really like to thank them for giving us all this time tonight, traveling this far, and giving us, this is months and months and months of work that they did. And however, whatever we end up doing with it here, I think we need more. This is what we need, because these people have been nutting through this since all year. So.
We totally appreciate it.
Yeah.
Totally appreciate it. And, you know, points of view, all of this is going to have to be melded together into one package. And whatever help we can get from you guys is important for us.
Sure, just have Tim reach out if you want.
We appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I know you got to drive, so I'll let you go.
Thank you.
We've got a couple more items to cover here tonight.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Thanks.
Goodbye. Hey, man, good to see you. I've been seeing you for like a decade.
Thank you.
See you.
No, we're not
We're
done.
not done yet.
I'll take care of it, Jackie. Yeah, that's fine.
How do you feel about sending this up to Tim and get his ideas?
I think we should have them
Absolutely.
take a look at it.
Okay, all right. So a motion to have that done, please, so we can document it.
Want to make a motion to pass this information along to Tim for his opinion? Second?
All those in favor, please signify. Thank you. Okay, I think I want to make sure we documented that. The only other issue I want to cover this evening is the extension of the moratorium. Obviously, we're not going to get done by the 15th of November. And the selectmen, I indicated to the selectmen that once we make a position, we should share it with them and then they vote. And I mentioned it last Thursday night, and I said, I hope that by the next meeting they have in October, they can extend the moratorium. It does not take a public hearing or a special town meeting. It's a vote of the selectmen to extend the moratorium based on the recommendation of the planning board. So I need a motion from the planning board to do so.
Make a motion that we extend the moratorium for another 6 months, right?
November 15th to May 15th. Is there a
Or we
second?
recommend to the selectmen.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, call for a vote. All those in favor? Okay, any other comments?
Thank you.
Is there any limit to how long you can extend it?
It gets a little sticky after the third one.
Yeah, get moving.
We gotta show some documentation.
We should check your box first before we go.
Third one coming out.
Yeah.
Well, here's the timing. If we are successful to get it done by May 15th, we have a gap between May 15th and the regular town meeting to vote on it. So it might be a 30-day or a 90-day extension as opposed to a 6-month extension to get it to town meeting, because that gap between the moratorium wearing out, town meeting, they jump in with a contract.
So you're asking for the second extension of that?
This would be the second extension. Yeah. So
No, this is the third.
we meant, oh, this would be the third. It went from February, November to February, or May, and May to November. So this would be the third. Okay. But it's a second extension. The first one was voted on by the town meeting.
They get 3 extensions.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. The town meeting was 1, and the board will have made 2.
2 years.
Ray, were you saying that if at the end of this last extension, that because the town meeting is after that, that's dangerous, or should we, in terms of another company coming in with a,
Well, no. If we extended the moratorium for another 6 months, that would be the 15th of May.
okay.
And between the 15th of May, unless we had a special town meeting on the 16th of May, an application could come in,
Mhm.
at which time we wouldn't have this ordinance in place.
Right.
Once the application is in, you can't,
Oh,
you know,
right.
they're coming in prior to the ordinance. So if they came in prior to the acceptance of an ordinance, the ordinance would not affect them. They have,
Well, why don't we do a special town meeting?
What's the deadline?
Can we do that?
How much time do we have before we have to act on an application?
well, once it's recognized and accepted by the code enforcement officer,
There's so many days.
with 30 days.
So we have 30 days before we have to act on that application.
So let's worry about that.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, but still.
You can't change the law.
It's far away.
No, I'm not saying change the law. Right now, there is something in place. There's 30 days that the planning board has to act.
So I have a question.
Yes.
We've been working on this, on the fence issue. We're not going to get to it tonight, right? Yeah. So, Jed had some comments, and I also have been working on it. And so I've kept them separate with my initials. Jed, I noticed, did the same thing.
I've got the same set, so I
So
get
we
the same
wouldn't
thing.
put them into the main document, right?
No, yeah, no.
Yeah. So we'll talk about it like maybe the next meeting.
What I'd like to do,
Leave standing people on.
Well, not me, but I'm just saying, we have a certain amount of time before we have to act on it. And I thought that is, he said it's 30 days, but.
what I'd like to do is exactly what we've done with every other ordinance over time. Every single ordinance that we've done, we go page by page or section by section. And that would get a consensus on page by
We
page
know how
by page.
that goes.
Good, let's do it.
And
It's the
that's
only
what
way
I
we
want to
get
start
anywhere.
doing.
Even though we have this, that we're looking at, okay,
So
we're
we-
looking at this other thing now, but it sort of we lost our,
Oh, we're gonna hear from Tim, which that's critical.
yeah, and then we'll see what Tim says.
What he says.
So let's
But in
continue.
the meantime, we can continue that because that's a land base.
I know.
And we can always weave other stuff into it, but the only way we're gonna make any headway in progress is to start at the beginning and go,
Page by page.
and
by
not
page.
skipping
So
over.
can
We need to
commit
read
starting
everything.
that next
Isn't
meeting?
Tim supposed to be writing this and we should?
No.
comment?
No, he doesn't write
He is
ordinances.
not writing it.
He does not write
It
it.
is our job.
We write the ordinance.
But he's
He
gotta
is
make
giving
it.
guidance.
He gives us legal guidance.
But the whole thing was we got $100,000 and the reason for that was that you got people like, it's not like the guys with the, the restaurant and the post office there. We're talking about guys with millions of dollars.
They don't write ordinances. That's not his wheelhouse. That is up to the planning board.
He gives us a guidance.
But he's gonna put the tight language.
Giving us the guide, yeah.
So that if they hit us, we're
Yeah.
tight. It's not because we're not lawyers. That's the
Right.
thing. And he is.
Prior to this current fiscal gubernatorial administration, we once upon a time, 6 years ago, had a state planning office. We had a planning board in Hancock County Planning Commission. Between the state planning office and Hancock County Planning Commission, they provided us with ordinances, guidance on ordinances. Hancock County Planning Commission has gone down the tubes a little bit and are coming back to life. They have a specialist now that you're working with that's working on transportation aspects. When we were fully staffed, and I was a treasurer on that for 20 years, when we were fully staffed, they handled us, helped us do everything that Kim Peace has done. They don't have that. So we've
They
had to,
understand ordinances.
and they culled the ordinances all over the state and pulled out the best parts and gave us things that we've been able to adopt. And that's how we put them in place. We don't have the planning office going
get
into
that,
stuff.
no, I know.
So,
But the past ordinances that we have changed is we sit down at a table and we go through each line
Right,
item.
well-
And we discuss it as a group and we work through it.
I'm a new guy, so I don't want to be a
All
wise
right, new
guy.
guy.
Huh?
Listen up, new guy.
I know, but here's the only difference. This is the difference, is that we've never had a challenge like this from a predatory company with
I
millions
understand
of
that.
dollars. That
Right.
they have lawyers that if
And
we're
that's
not
why
tight,
we're asking for public input and expert input,
We need the-
but we still have to write the ordinance.
yeah, but it doesn't need to be like gone over by Tim.
it will be.
Will be.
It will be.
So
It
it's
will
tight.
make sure it's legal, and I get a couple
When
other
we get
sources.
to the end of it. And then, by the time we get to the end of it, we may decide to go back and change something else.
Right,
Something
well,
else may come up.
Would it be worth getting Tim's opinion on what the legal journey would be if we were to adopt this model ordinance and challenge the state? Because that's a precedent-setting legal journey.
It's part of the conversation I will have with him on that.
So we haven't really heard that.
Not yet, we haven't discussed, we have not discussed.
He's going to comment on that.
What I'd like to do, in starting on the page by page by page, is I'd like our secretary to ship individual pages, so that you only have to print out one page.
That's a good plan. I like that.
And that way, instead of 16 pages to mark up,
Yeah.
bring one page at a time.
Mine.
One
Well, we'll
page at a
print
time.
everybody copies the next time. That's all we need.
Let me.
Then decided, but then it doesn't have, it doesn't have Jed's comments or it doesn't have.
Well,
That's-
you can bring your comments to the table.
This document is not a place to put comments on.
Right, that's why
So-
I didn't do it.
The reason that we were doing it the way, and this is how we've done it in the past, is we go through, we discuss, we decide,
And then you type it
we
in.
cross out anything we don't want in, and then it gets added in a different color. We have to keep the original.
Yep, I understand.
And it's not a place for comments, it's what we're doing with this ordinance. Comments we can talk about.
Okay.
Ideas we could talk about, and decisions for how we're changing it go here.
Right.
So
Because it
what,
gets
what
too
are, what's the
confusing.
process then? I don't understand. I thought we were putting comments and people were writing stuff. That's wrong.
That's wrong.
So how, what are we,
No
what are we
comments
doing?
on the actual ordinance.
Well, that's why you saved it with your
Single
initials
page.
and I
If
saved
you
mine
have a-
with my
if you have a-
initials.
If you
Just
have a
how
single
it's
page,
thought.
on page 1, you write you send your
Oh,
comments.
all
in.
right.
Page 2,
All right.
and then when
Yeah.
we sit down with those pages,
And then we'll
then
talk
your
about it.
comments, and then we come up with a common position.
Because
And
if
they're
everybody's
So there'll be
putting comments,
overview, the overview in the front of what we want to comment on and then we
Yeah.
talk, is that?
if everybody's placing comments in the middle of this, in different, do you know how confusing this
No, I
is
think
gonna
we,
get?
we understand.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not asking about it.
Like you said, you're a newbie.
Yeah.
We'll get
We'll
along.
train you, we'll train you.
We'll get you organized.
We'll get you there.
All right, we got anything else on the table tonight? I will be in contact with Tim this week. We'll see where it goes. He'll get it. I believe he has a copy of it. If he doesn't, we'll make sure we get one to him. Okay? I need a motion.
I make a motion to
Yeah,
adjourn.
do we have an electronic copy of this thing? Oh, I've got the hard copy.
I'll scan it and email it to you. Will that help?
I can scan it.
I can send
Well,
it
then
to
you'll
you.
have an electronic copy. You can put it in PDF form and there you go. You got it.
Well, I don't know if I can put it in PDF. form.
I'll scan it and send it to you tomorrow. In a couple of versions, and see if you can work. That help?
Can I say one last thing? What will really make your life easier for these track changes?
Track changes.
And Deirdre will hold the seminar, right?
Yep.
Because she'd really good at it. Super
am.
easy, you guys. And then we know exactly what happened, what came out, and he doesn't have to type and everything. Telling
We
you,
don't want stuff to come out. We just want to cross it up.
Nobody
We want to
keeps it.
see.
No,
nobody
you can-
tells you who crossed it out, who said it,
And it
and
under-
what day it was.
you
And
can
Yeah, but no,
strike
We don't
you're
need
you're
that.
missing
We
the
don't need
point, I think.
We don't need that.
They don't want.
So we don't want you to cross out what you don't want, and we don't want Jeff to cross out what he doesn't want to see in there, and then everybody's adding stuff in. This is the working document, and so what that means is when we sit here at the table and discuss something, when we all decide we want to make that change, then it gets put in. We're not,
Okay,
do you know what I mean? We don't want all that in this document.
I understand.
We'll work our way through it, folks.
sorry.
I need a motion.
Med motion.
Is there a second?
Yeah.
Second?
All those in favor? We are adjourned.
Oh, John.
Thank you, folks. It's okay. Mother's Day.
Do you go back already? You leaving? Are you gonna, Jerry,
One way or
are
another.
you gonna zoom in, Jerry? What are you gonna zoom in?
Oh, yes.
The bandwidth is zooming in because.
I'll miss you.
Board told me I gotta always be on your.
I love it. Oh,
That
You was right.
hey, that's the mole right there.
Aha.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night,
Thank
Jen.
you. Oh, my God.
I'm not a lawyer, but the answer I got to my question didn't really help me any.
It didn't.
Yeah, but
You look through
that ordinance impacts the water. I have a lot of fear of what impacts on the land.
Oh, stop recording. I won't be able to put this up on YouTube tomorrow.
All right.
So I don't want to get out of it and not do that. What did you make? She made it from anything.